This evening's session of our symposium, Spirit of the Earth, is the Richard Thompson Memorial Lecture. Our speaker is Mr. A. John Waubonsie. The Memorial Lecture is held in honor of the memory of Richard Thompson from Kansas City, Missouri, who was a student here at Iowa State University. He graduated in 1971 with majors in geology and anthropology. While Rick was here in Ames, he was clerk of the Friends meeting. He left Iowa State University after being a member of Cardinal Key and after being co-founder of the United Native American Student Association, UNASA, and worked with the American Friends Service Committee, first in Washington and then in Vietnam. He was a civilian worker at Quang Ngai Hospital in Vietnam and was killed in an airplane crash in November 1973. Our speaker this evening, Mr. John Waubonsie, is a Prairie Band Potawatomi from Kansas. He grew up in South Dakota on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation, attended Grinnell College, and then obtained his law degree at DePaul University in Chicago. He has been a practicing attorney for 5 years in Boulder, Colorado. He is with the Native American Rights Fund. One of the cases which he has been working on is the Meskwaki hunting rights case, or as Don Wanatee, also a co-founder of the UNASA puts it, the frozen squirrel case, which is still being considered, I think, by the courts. But we're sure that they will win the case and they can take the squirrel out of the freezer. Perhaps Mr. Waubonsie can elaborate on that squirrel too this evening. The title of Mr. Waubonsie's talk this evening is Behind the Headlines.
Thank you. By way of introduction, I am an attorney with a firm called the Native American Rights Fund. We are the only Indian interest law firm in the United States. We're primarily funded from private foundations, but in the last few years we've been moving towards trying to broaden our base of support and have gone to soliciting contributions from the public. And I will take this opportunity to plug our program so that in case you ever get a little flyer, we do a blind mailings, get a little flyer that you would carefully consider including us in your donations. We are a firm that tries not to depend on federal funding, and we're trying to broaden our support. Enough of the plugs. What I'd like to do is to talk about some of the issues in American Indian law as they are making the headlines today. Try and go into the background of why the law is what it is in terms of a historical analysis, and try and convey to you some of the feelings, some of the real parties, some of the real issues in terms of survival of an indigenous people in the United States, and why these people have taken their matters to court, what I think about the success of that, and possibly some observations about the future, where we're going. One of the things that, when you talk about American Indian law, as you do with most legal matters, that you're conceptualizing, and you're taking the reality away from it and putting it into hard, dry little briefs that don't often reflect the political realities. For Indians, especially, to practice law is in a sense, a very strange thing, because no other profession embodies the Anglo-Saxon value system more than the law does. But nevertheless, in the last 10 years, the largest postgraduate profession for Native Americans has been the law. That Indians, we are now almost being inundated by a flood of new, young Indian attorneys, that the best and the brightest, to coin a phrase, the best and the brightest seem to be going into law. It's law is where the action is now for the Native Americans. It's almost to the same extent that young whites are leaving law school and going to journalism school in hopes that they'll find Mr. Woodward and Mr. Bernstein's success. But in discussing American Indian law, the concept that runs through it, the legal concept, is distinguished from the political reality, is the notion of sovereignty. That is, American Indian tribes are sovereign at the basis, are sovereign entities. That they have, at the time of the discovery of the United States, complete political and social autonomy. That they were, in fact, nations in the fullest legal sense of the word. That they had the power to deal with a variety of foreign nations, treaties, agreements. They could war on one nation and the other. They could receive ambassadors, as some people were styled. They were recognized by the European powers as being a sovereign. And tribes, as the courts have recognized, derive their sovereignty from their existence, from their mere existence as an Indian tribe. They do not derive their sovereignty from a grant of power from the Congress of the United States, or from a state, or from any other body. Now, this is a very nice concept in the abstract, but it has very real meanings when put into the 19th and 20th century context of Native Americans. Right now, I can safely say that a tribe has all powers of a sovereign except two, or except those powers specifically taken by Congress. The loss of these two powers is simply because the United States has established control over the continental boundaries of the United States. And as a result of that, Indian tribes lack the power to make treaties with other foreign nations. And as the Supreme Court said about 3 weeks ago, they lack the power to try non-Indians in their tribal court systems. Very, very important power. Congress has limited their powers in very few ways, Indian tribes' powers in very few ways, by specific congressional action. Probably the most important limitation on tribes' powers across the board is that Congress has taken away the power of tribes to try Indians who commit a felony within the boundaries of the reservation. That's it. 1887, Congress passed the Major Crimes Act. And that's really within an abstract legal concept, and it's the concepts that we start working from. That's the limits on tribes' powers. Now, in specific cases, specific tribes, Congress may have acted in particular areas, so that, for example, my tribe in Kansas, the Prairie Band Potawatomi, Congress has conferred upon the state of Kansas civil and criminal jurisdictional powers. That is, the state of Kansas courts have the power to hear civil and criminal matters arising on the reservation. Most reservations don't have that. In Iowa, the state of Iowa has the power to hear criminal misdemeanor cases, civil cases, and possibly hunting and fishing cases. But that's it. If a felony is committed on the Meskwaki Reservation right now, that offender would be tried in federal court. As a result of tribe sovereignty, and as a result of their occupancy of specific areas of land, I will try and get away from abstracts, but I think I can sketch the abstract background before sort of getting to the core, the nitty-gritty, the good stuff. As a result of tribe sovereignty and their occupancy of land, again, prior to the coming of the white man and after the white man came, Indians had what's called an aboriginal Indian title. The Supreme Court has defined this as the tribe's exclusive right of use and occupancy of land. So if you look at Indian history in the 19th century and the 18th century, the process, you'll see that the process is taking the Indians' right of use and occupancy and converting it to a recognized title in the Indians and a recognized title in the federal government so the federal government can sell the land. It was a diminishment process almost. Now you can use pejorative terms, land steals, terms like that. But if you look at it from a historical point of view, it was a process of the tribes converting their use and occupancy rights into a recognized title that could be possibly alienated. Now, how valuable is this use of right and occupancy? It's something that doesn't come to mind very often, but in 1971, Congress had to confront the question of Aboriginal title, which had not been extinguished in a state. It was the state of Alaska. Aboriginal title had remained unextinguished in Alaska until 1971. Congress had to figure out how are they going to convert Aboriginal title into a recognized title in the Indians, compensate them for loss of their Aboriginal title. At the same time, confirm them some rights in land. How much do you pay the tribes? What do you give the tribes? The settlement in Alaska, 1971, called the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, provided that the natives would take confirmed title, recognized title, fee simple title, whatever term you want to use, for 40 million acres of land, a tenth of the state of Alaska, and they would be paid $1 billion. That gives you an idea of the value of an Aboriginal title, because it gives the Indians the right to use and occupy land. And nobody wants to have a use and occupancy right outstanding against them. In Alaska, one of the things that happened was that there was a political pressure put on by the oil companies and the pipeline companies to get the Aboriginal title extinguished so that they could start developing the oil. But nevertheless, that shows you the value of an Aboriginal title in a 20th century market. Now, the second question that would come up is, what happens if the Aboriginal title to your land, to your quarter-acre subdivision, is not properly extinguished? What's that leave you with? Well, that's what the good citizens of Maine are facing right now. Because in Maine, Aboriginal title, after 180 years, they found out was not properly extinguished, and Aboriginal, that the natives, the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy tribe, still have Aboriginal title, may have, probably do, Aboriginal title to two-thirds of the state of Maine. How can something like that happen? Well, Congress, in 1785, one of the first acts of the Congress that was created after the new Constitution, passed an act called the Trade and Intercourse Act. What it purported to do, it said that if states, private citizens cannot deal with Indian tribes for their land, cannot attempt to purchase or extinguish Indians' Aboriginal title unless Congress consents. In other words, Congress prohibited states and private individuals from dealing with Indian tribes for their lands. A very, very important piece of legislation, and reflects the historical realities of the late 19th century, late 18th century. Because Indian tribes at that time were still politically very important on the frontier, that there was still a British-dominated government in Canada, which was adverse to the United States, that the British and the United States had conflicts entitled to what's called the Old Northwest, the area of Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana, and that the Indians, in many ways, were the balance of power on the frontier. And it was a political necessity for the United States to prohibit states from dealing with Indian tribes, because if a state screwed the situation up, if it offended the Indian tribes, and there was war, you would have, one, them going to their British allies, and two, it was a war not a state would have to fight, but that the federal government would have to fight. Secondly, from a more possibly practical standpoint, land was the major source of revenue for the United States. The United States obtained its operating revenues to run its government, its armies, from sales of lands. And that the only way that it could obtain the revenue would be to buy it from Indians and then resell it to the whites. One economic historian claims that the whole reason for the income tax was the fact that the government ran out of lands to sell. But nevertheless, the federal government preempted this field of purchase of lands from Indians. Nevertheless, the state of Massachusetts, at the time when Maine was still part of Massachusetts, negotiated with the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy Indians for their land and signed an agreement. This agreement, everybody thought, was the basis for Maine, what later became the state of Maine, owning vast tracts of land, and the state of Maine having the power to sell lands to timber companies. In 1972, the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy tribes put the two documents together and said, wait a minute, that doesn't, the agreement between the state and our tribe in 1790 doesn't comply with the Trade and Intercourse Act. It's void. There's no agreement. The Aboriginal title remains unextinguished. So the theory went. Penobscots and Passamaquoddies in 1972 sued the United States to compel the United States to file a suit on their behalf against the state of Maine, arguing that they still had Aboriginal title, that the United States as trustee of the tribe had to protect it. And that case was litigated, and it was won. And the federal court said yes, the 1790 agreement was void, and yes, Aboriginal title was unextinguished. At that point, the state of Maine blew up. Bond market went dry. You couldn't transfer any real estate. All of a sudden, people began screaming in the state of Maine about 180-year-old rights, and why should they come back to haunt us? And why would the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy tribe be concerned? Because they had lost their land in the intervening 180 years. Under that agreement, the state of Maine had said that we were going to confirm title in your lands, but in fact had let their lands be sold and trespassed upon and lost. And so by 1972, the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy tribes were poor tribes. They had lost their land. I suspect that if the state of Maine had treated the Indians fairly and honorably, had protected their lands, that conceivably this litigation never arose. But they had lost their lands. The state of Maine had not protected them, so they went back after the state of Maine. And you hear the white politicians, you see the newspapers about evicting people from their quarter-acre subdivision lots. You know, that the Indians have no right to this land. The fact of the matter, I believe that morally they do, and legally. Now, of course, the tribe is a very realistic tribe, and are not really pushing their claims against the small property owners. As a matter of fact, they're pushing their claim against what's called the big property owners, those people who own 50,000 acres of land or more, of which I think there are 7, including the state of Maine, 6 private landowners and 1, the state of Maine. That's who they're pushing their claim against. And there has been a solution proposed by the president, which I think is very fair, I think is very reasonable. some of the politicians in Maine don't think so. But nevertheless, a solution has been offered. I think the case will be resolved by compromise, by action by Congress. I don't think anybody wants to litigate the case, but the tribe is fully prepared, I think, to proceed with it. Now, the most common way that Indian lands were purchased, again, some people using pejorative terms, stolen or ripped off or what have you. The way that Indian lands were usually conveyed to the United States from an Indian tribe was through the process of a treaty. And usually a treaty was a simple conveyance instrument, a contract, that the Indian tribe would give its aboriginal title to the United States. The United States would give money, recognize some title in the tribe, recognize the tribe's right to certain lands, and some other, usually some additional promises. For example, in the Navajos, one of the treaty provisions is that the government will provide one teacher for every 25 students that is brought to the agency headquarters. My tribe in the Treaty of 1833 was promised a blacksmith, a wheelwright, and a doctor, a physician. But usually the key provisions were land in exchange for money and other land. Some cases they were simply just treaties of peace. That the tribe agreed to be at peace with the United States, which, again, in the turbulent political era of the early 19th century, may have been the most important thing the United States could obtain. And a treaty, again, to the abstract, is the supreme law of the land, because it was ratified by the Senate, signed by the executive. According to the Constitution, supreme law of the land. Like a statute, it doesn't lose its validity simply by the passage of time. The only way that a treaty provision can be modified is through an express act of Congress or a subsequent treaty, modifying the original treaty. Again, very nice and abstract. Let's look at one particular treaty, the Northwest Washington Fishing Treaties. The northwest part of the United States in the 1850s, Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens negotiated a series of treaties with the small tribes of Northwest Washington. And the small tribes agreed to cede their control over their vast domain of land in return for smaller reservations. And, as the treaty says, the Indians would reserve the right to hunt and fish in common with citizens of the territory at their usual and accustomed spots, or usual and accustomed places, I'm sorry. Very innocuous language. It's made a lot of lawyers rich. It's been litigated constantly for almost 100 years. What does that phrase mean? When the tribes reserve to themselves the right to hunt and fish off of the reservation at their usual and accustomed places, in common with the citizens of the territory. What does that mean? Well, it means, right now, after a protracted series of litigation in federal court in Tacoma, Washington, for Judge Bolt, and later decision affirmed by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court refusing to review the decision. What that means, according to Judge Bolt, is that the Indians have the right to take half of the catchable fish in the drainages of the Puget Sound every year. Before, they've been taking about 5%. And now, the in common provision was interpreted to mean 1/2. The state of Washington went right up the wall. The commercial fishermen went right up the wall. The sports fishermen went right up the wall. The Indians got happy. It has created, again, as in Maine, a political turmoil which conceivably could result in congressional action stripping a court-won victory away from the Indians. Because the Indians are
intent on exercising their right, because they say we gave up vast amounts of land in return for small land but retaining our traditional right to fish. To fish as we knew how to do it. And to fish in common, but nevertheless to fish with the non-Indians. Fish is the basis of our existence. And fishing in the Northwest is one of the dominant industries, commercial fishing and sports fishing.
Again, politically, the Indians are a minority in terms of absolute voters up there. Less than 1% of the voters. This was the beginning of what's called the white backlash movement. And there was an article in Newsweek this week which I think states to the effect that the Indian movement is for real because it's generated a substantial and deep-felt white backlash movement. And the white backlash movement is out there, and it's real, and it's trying to strip tribes of their victories. In Washington, for example, Congressman Lloyd Meads represents a district which has several fishing reservations in it. Congressman Meads, until 1976, was the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Indian Affairs, the Committee of the Interior. Congressman Meads had been for example, one of the principal architects of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Again, most Indians consider to be a very fair and reasonable act. He'd always been known as a very fair and reasonable man. In the last month of his race for re-election, 1976, I think Congressman Meads is an 11-term congressman, the fishing issue became the prime issue, and that Congressman Meads was accused of being pro-Indian. And Congressman Meads said, "No, I'm not." And what you had two candidates trying to do was outright each other, out-anti-Indian each other. And Congressman Meads won re-election by 356 votes, basically on the strength of the absentee ballots, which are cast 2 and 3 weeks prior to the election. So if it had come down to counting everybody voting on election day, Meads would have probably lost. And the Indian issue was the issue that was key. Had promptly raised warning signals of politicians wherever. There were strong Indian court victories and substantial white opposition. Congressman Meads resigned his chairmanship of his subcommittee, and upon returning to Congress, promptly introduced a bill which would first create a fishing commission which would control the Indians' fishing rights, which would be controlled by non-Indians, which would be a 9-person commission with 1 Indian on it. Subsequently introduced 2 bills which would limit Indians' water rights and Indians' jurisdictional rights. That's a very real effect of white backlash. Another effect of white backlash, I think, is closer to home. An admiration that I have that many people don't necessarily share, but nevertheless, the admiration I have is for a senator from South Dakota, James Aberesk. I think one of the truly independent voices in the Congress, in the Senate especially. Senator Aberesk has always been noted for his strong pro-Indian positions. And being the only congressman, having been born and raised on the reservation in Rosebud Sioux, had a very deep, and I think, abiding understanding and knowledge of Indians. South Dakota, like Washington, is one of the states that's in the center of the backlash movement, the heart of the backlash movement. I think Senator Aberesk, he will not admit it, but I think Senator Aberesk has declined to run for the Senate this year, based, I think, principally on his pro-Indian views in a state which is not noted for his pro-Indian views. That his strong pro-Indian views had alienated him from the majority of his voters. I don't think he wanted to risk defeat. Senator Aberest, in his reasons, says that personal commitments, the stress on his family, and so forth, were his prime considerations. But I think deep in his heart, he realized he would not be reelected. And it's a shame, but the fact of the matter is, rather than change his views, I think he couldn't live with himself. I think as Congressman Means possibly did, that he chose not to run for re-election. Again, it's the backlash movement. And I think this is a fear, not a fear, but a problem that Indians are facing as we win more and more victories in the courts. Courts have not necessarily been sympathetic to us, but courts have simply been recognizing the law as it's been written over 190 years. And they are vindicating rights that the Indians have always had. It's not a case of being sympathetic, it's not a case of not being sympathetic, it's a question of simply interpreting the laws that now exist. The court victories have engendered a tremendous reaction within the congressional community. We had a bill introduced this year, it's commonly called the Cunningham Bill, which would simply abrogate all treaties. Simply say treaties that no longer have any effect. It's called the Native American Equal Opportunity Act. It's to treat all Indians the same as whites. The leading backlash organization, often referred to as the Rednecks, is a thing called the Interstate Congress for Equal Rights and Responsibilities. And that's their key word, equal rights and responsibilities, saying that Indians should be treated exactly as everybody else. They should have the same rights as non-Indians. The fact of the matter is that Indians don't have the same rights because we have a third citizenship. Common fiction in the law is that you're a state citizen, you're a federal citizen, and you have different rights and responsibilities deriving from each citizenship. It's a nice, neat legal fiction, but it's a fiction that courts look at all the time. Well, Indians have a third set of citizenship rights. Your citizenship rights based as a member of a tribe that has been recognized by the United States as having self-governing powers. Political process of equal rights and responsibilities, purported equal rights and responsibilities, is a very real threat. It's not so much a threat in Iowa, because in Iowa, Indians yet have not come in conflict with any vested interests of the non-Indians. One of the things I found when I went east to school was it becomes better to be an Indian the further you get away from the reservation. That to be an Indian in Rosebud is not such a good thing, but to be an Indian in Boston, at least in 1963 and 1964, was a good thing. Because the Indians were strange and mysterious creatures, and everybody wanted to come up and shake your hand and say how glad they were to meet you. But you didn't pose a threat to them. Winter, South Dakota, and Martin, South Dakota, Snowflake, Arizona, Bellingham, Washington, Reno, Nevada, Indians are a very real threat to the existing ways of life. And that's where the backlash movement comes from. I would dare say that if Indians won some victory, legal victory, in the state of Iowa, which extended beyond the boundaries of their reservation, that say that the tribe would win a right to hunt and fish off of the reservation, their former lands is guaranteed by the 1825 treaty, then possibly you might see a very real backlash movement. So, but that's the political, that's what's happening, I think. And that is that
the headlines are splashing big victories for Indians, that the non-Indian community on and near reservations is organizing in a fashion that they've never organized before, with money, with good attorneys, with an effective lobby. But they have pressured congressmen to introduce unconstitutional legislation, and if not unconstitutional, at least legislation which runs counter to basic notions of fairness and decency, that Indians are continually being forced into roles which are not of their own choosing. That this is what's happening behind the headlines. The reality is, I think, if I can do what I hate to do, and that is to generalize about Indians, the reality of the situation is that all we are concerned about is being able to determine our own existence, our own future, in our own ways, so that I, as a Potawatomi, can control the ways that people of my tribe on my reservation will develop, and that the Winnebagos in Nebraska will be able to control their own reservation and their own existence so that they can find their own place. The Navajos, the Papagos, the Pimas, and so forth and so on. That's all we want, I think. But I guess what we have to say is that when it comes to the political fight, we have to come to concern non-Indians. We're willing to look behind the headlines. We're willing to look at the hard issues. Look at the real problems. And then offer their support. Write to your congressman. It's always the easiest and most effective thing to do. Because again, we are in a battle for our very existence. Thank you very much.
Monica probably answered. Mr. Bonsi, answer any questions.
subsequent